Canadian economy is revving its engine and leaving behind in the dust a grim forecast from economists and the Bank of Canada. The economy expanded at the fastest pace in 2 years in the third quarter, at an annual pace of 2.7%. And that's far faster than the growth we saw in the second quarter of the year, just 1.6%. Canada is now keeping pace with the U.S., which grew at a 2.8% pace in the quarter.
All right, the survey says our first look at third quarter GDP, better than expected, 2.8%. And I'll tell you what, that is definitely more than I was looking for.
The Nigerian economy grew by 6.81% in the third quarter of this year, up from 6.18% in the previous quarter.
China's economy has rebounded in the third quarter of 2013, with GDP growing to 7.8% in the period of July to September.
How we describe success affects what we strive for. If GDP is what we think is success, people will strive for GDP. And political leaders all the time say, look at what we've done. They always put it, I've succeeded in getting the economy to grow at 6%. Now, what he did is hard to figure out, but that's the politician does that. I've created X million jobs. So that's part of the political rhetoric. The question is, by doing that, they focus policies on things that will increase GDP. We spend more on health care than any other country as a percentage of GDP, and our health outcomes are much lower than in other advanced industrial countries, and actually lower than many developing countries. Well, the extra money that we spent on health care shows up as a contribution to GDP. If we got more efficient, our GDP could go down. Well, that's clearly not, you don't want to, you're looking at the wrong thing.
GDP is the most well-known measure of economic performance in the world. However, GDP measures all economic activity, fighting crime, natural disasters, and environmental depletion, whether or not it contributes to an individual's well-being or a community's progress. GDP also doesn't show how a nation's wealth is distributed. Britain's economy has grown faster than most European countries over the last decade, but this growth has done little to narrow the gap between rich and poor. This is the City of London, the world's leading international business and financial centre. It's the richest region in Europe, and many of the people who work here are staggeringly wealthy. Yet just over a kilometre from the city, many people live in poverty. In the borough of Bethnal Green, almost half the children live in families where at least one parent is out of work.
In a society where only few people gets very, very rich and the rest is very, very poor, is not very much sustainable in the long run.
The paradox is that although Western countries have got immeasurably wealthier over the last 50 years, many people don't feel richer, and those that have made it are not necessarily happier.
But it's only growing for the richer. It's not going for the ordinary working class person. It's getting worse.
People will tell you that they feel their life is increasingly difficult and stressful. So it's obvious that we've got a kind of false god if we're saying that almost anything is justified if it produces an increase in GDP.
GDP is a good way of measuring production, but there's an increasing consensus that new tools are needed for calculating progress, well-being, and our ecological footprint on the planet.
About this index, what it measures, what questions it asks.
Well, as you mentioned, Mark, we've been very good at measuring economic progress, and as a result, we've really focused on economic progress. We've actually made marginal our social progress, and those institutions have suffered, not only in the developing world, but in the developed world. So we believe it's time to bring these two indices together, GDP, our measures of economic progress, together with our measures of social progress.
And this index paints it very clearly, doesn't it, that economic growth doesn't automatically lead to social advancement. You've just got to look at some of the results. I mean, look at China, look at India, both economies that over the last decade have grown 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%, but they're very low down in the rankings, aren't they?
They are indeed. And in fact, this new metric for measuring social progress has three really critical dimensions. The first is how well societies meet the basic needs of their citizens. The second, the building blocks for those societies to advance. And the third is opportunity. So countries may meet the basic needs of their citizens, but fall down on the building blocks and on opportunity. And that's often the case in these developing world countries like China and India, where opportunity isn't as strong. In the U.S., for example, we're very strong on opportunity, but we're falling down in the middle.
And the U.S. in the league table comes 16th, the U.K. 13th. I think France was 20th.
Exactly.
So they're quite low down, lower than you might assume.
Yeah, yes, indeed. In fact, none of the G7 are in the top 10, which is actually sobering.